March 5th, 1963, a Piper Comanche crashes and we lose Patsy Cline in her prime. We're going to talk about it today on this podcast.
On Taking Off.
Taking Off podcast. Christy, this is the first one.
Yeah, Taking Off podcast. I thought this would be a really great topic since we're coming up on the 60th anniversary, number one.
Of Patsy Cline.
60 years since this crash happened, but also because we are feverishly working on this story.
Yeah, so we're working on a Taking Off video. And you know, this is our first podcast. I was actually working... I've got a different podcast subject I was going to do for our first one, but you came in because we're going to be filming today your stand-up of the Patsy Cline crash, and you found a whole bunch of stuff that probably won't even make it into that video that you wanted to talk about on this. So Patsy Cline, you know, died on March 5th, 1963, the 60th anniversary, and, you know, dig into this. What did you find?
Oh, my gosh. First of all, I think it's important for everybody to know just how much work goes into these stories because some are cut and dry. When I did John Denver, that took me about 3 days. That script took me 3 days to write. And, you know, it's funny. I remember writing the script and then sending it to you. And I remember your first reaction to it was, well, there's a lot of information here about John Denver. And I was like, yeah, but...
Before the crash.
Right, before the crash.
Right,
like,
about his life.
But with John Denver, it was different because John's personality, his experiences, all of that led up to him, you know, getting into this crash. With Patsy Cline, it's different. And there's 2 or 3 different angles that we can take the story. It's kind of like Buddy Holly, you know? And the one thing that I regret with the Buddy Holly story that we did was that we didn't really focus at all on the other passengers. And we certainly didn't put a lot of focus on the pilot. You know, it was...
We put some.
Well, but the sad thing is that there's not a lot of information out there.
Right.
And it's a very similar situation with the Patsy Cline crash. So it's really interesting. The pilot was actually her manager. So again, I focus on Patsy Cline because there's a whole backstory and it leads up to it with her trying to get famous, basically. And she gets a little bit of success. Her success goes down. She's got this whole up and down career in the late 50s. But then she decides, her and her second husband, Charlie Dick, decide that they are going to move their family to Nashville so that she can really pursue her musical career. And it was a very fateful decision because she wound up meeting Randy Hughes and she hired him as her manager. Randy Hughes would wind up being the pilot of that airplane that she would die in. And so it's like this build up, but that's when she started seeing success as well, was because of Randy Hughes. So when you look at the story, it's very bittersweet because Randy Hughes was very instrumental in her becoming more successful. It was her dream was to go on the Grand Ole Opry, and he made that happen for her. She became a member of the Grand Ole Opry because of him, but then it was because of him that she would lose everything in that moment.
I guess it's the difference between John Denver and this case is that, you know, John Denver, we knew a lot about the pilot. The pilot was John Denver. I think that as we go through all these celebrity airplane crashes, John Denver is, of course, going to be the outlier. Very few times is the celebrity the actual pilot. So Buddy Holly, Patsy Cline, these are going to be more the standard. So that's interesting. And, you know, I knew you were working on this, and so I kind of did some research as well and could not find very much on Randy.
There's not. There really isn't a lot of information on him. So the stuff that we do know is that, yeah, he was a manager, and he was also a skilled guitarist, and, you know, he was very musical in his own as well. But the other thing is that he was a very inexperienced pilot. He was a fairly new pilot, but I cannot even find information on...
Well, not according to ChatGPT.
Oh my goodness!
I did I had playing around with ChatGPT for the first time, and I said, write a news story on Randy Rhoads, manager and pilot for
Randy Hughes.
Randy Hughes, manager and pilot for Patsy Cline, include his certifications, and it came back with that he grew up loving aviation, would watch planes take off from nearby,
No.
that he was a CFI and all this kind of stuff before he flew the plane with Patsy
Dan,
Cline.
this is what happens when you let the robots do the work for you.
Right.
No,
this is why you don't do autopilot.
Right. This is why I'm an elitist and I like to hand fly. No, what we do know about Randy Hughes, no, he didn't have, from what I could gather, and if I'm wrong, I want if people have like more information out there, please, I want to know. But from what I could gather, he viewed aviation kind of like you did. You like aviation, but you use it as a tool.
Right.
That's what he did. He saw it as, hey, instead of driving 8 hours from Nashville to Kansas City or whatever, I could take a 2-hour plane ride. I can transport my musicians to and from concerts.
It's exactly my situation.
Exactly. He wanted to use it as a tool. And so that's what he did. But I can't find anything on his training when he even got his private pilot certificate. What we know is that he just bought the airplane within that year. It was a yellow Comanche that he bought.
Fairly new.
Yeah,
like 2 or 3 years old.
It was 3 years old.
Yeah.
It was this happened in 1963.
And it's a 1960.
It was a 1960 Comanche, and it was yellow. Mm-hmm. I knew that. It was yellow with green stripes on it. He had 160 hours total time, and he had 44 hours logged in the Comanche. So 44 hours. That's it.
Wow.
He did not have an instrument rating, and I can't even see if he had any real instrument training. So like the Buddy Holly crash, that pilot had instrument training. He had been signed off for his check ride, but he had failed his check ride. So he at least had the training. He wasn't experienced, and he didn't have the rating. That's the difference here. I can't find anything on Randy Hughes showing that he had any type of instrument training outside of what was required for his private pilot certification at that time.
The other interesting thing about this crash is that it happened almost exactly 4 years after Buddy Holly. So this was still fairly fresh.
Right.
That, the day the music died was 4 years before, where, famous musician piles into small airplane. And so...
Yeah, this is the day the country music died.
Right. Well, it took a lot of guts for Patsy to climb into that, but she had flown with him a little bit.
She had flown. She was an experienced passenger, I guess, if you will, where she had flown in commercial aircraft, which back in the 50s and 60s, it's not the airliners of today, of course. We're talking DC-3s and Constellations and primitive jets and things like that. But she had no reason to not trust Randy Hughes. She literally told him on that day, if you want to stay, we'll stay. If you want to go, we'll go. I trust you. She actually said that, based on eyewitness accounts. So the whole leading up to that, it's very interesting. I don't want to burn the candle, or burn the fuse on the story. It's so hard because there's so many little details that I want to put in the story, but you gotta kind of, cut it down.
Okay. Well, this podcast is a great way to do that because people can go and watch on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/takingoff, and check out Christy's Patsy Cline video, which will have already been posted by then, I'm sure. But when you dug into this, you found some interesting theories.
Oh, my goodness. Okay. So, if you look at their flight track from that day, so you got to kind of back it up a couple of days, actually. The whole reason they were in Kansas City, they had flown to Kansas City to do a benefit concert for another musician who had died in a car crash. This whole story is just riddled with tragedy. Patsy had gotten sick. She was actually, they don't know if she had the cold or flu or whatever.
Just like Richie Valens.
Right, exactly. Wasn't feeling well. But she performed 3 performances that night. They stayed the night in Kansas City, and they were supposed to depart the next morning, but they couldn't because the airport was fogged in. So even if they wanted to go, they couldn't. They weren't allowed to take off. So the day afterward, there was a line of storms that had come through. When you look at what their flight path was, it was very... Because when I first saw that, there was no explanation behind it. They went due south to Rogers, Arkansas, and then due east. I was like, why not? I mean, it's flat land. Why not just... And then when I started digging into it, I found that it was because they were trying to follow behind a line of storms. The whole trip that day was just turbulent and garbage. So they fly south and they land in Rogers because they need a break. They need, it's just moderate turbulence for a small Comanche. You know, they fueled up, took a breather, whatever, and then got in the airplane and they headed east. They land in Dyersburg, Tennessee, which is only about, I think it was like 70 or 90 miles. I can't remember exactly what, but it wasn't that far. It was within 100 miles of Nashville. And they were just waiting for the weather to move off. And while they're there, they decide to eat. There's a little restaurant in the airport, and there's also an FAA briefer live sitting there in the airport. And that's when Randy Hughes goes and he talks to Leroy Neal, who's the briefer. And the briefer tells him, bruh, I don't think you should go because I can't tell you whether to go or not. I'm not a cop, but I can tell you that it's not great weather here. It's deteriorating because the sun is getting ready to set, which means that now you've got the temperature and dew point spread coming together, and it's below VFR minima in Nashville at your destination. Well, Randy Hughes calls his wife, Kathy, and Kathy says, oh, no, the weather has passed. And so the passengers have all gone and sat in the restaurant. And of course, people have recognized them. They're, signing autographs and talking with other patrons of the restaurant. And Randy goes and he talks to the, Patsy Cline, Cowboy Copas, and Hawkshaw Hawkins, and he gives them kind of the information. And that's when Patsy says, well, if you want to stay the night, we can. In fact, they had been offered a free hotel overnight.
Wow.
Yeah. They had been offered to stay there for free. The airport manager at the time, his name was William. Oh, gosh, what was his name? It was William something. He actually says, hey, you guys can stay here, keep the airplane here, whatever. I don't think you should go. So many people came together to try to talk them out of going because they saw the conditions. But Randy was like, he literally said, we've come this far. We'll be home before you know it. And he assured William, hey, we'll get up, we'll take off. And if it gets bad, meaning if we get into the clouds or get into some bad weather, we'll just turn around and come back. And William said, you know what? I'm going to turn on the runway lights then for you. So that way you could just turn around and come back. Because he figured they were going to get up, get out, get going, realize it wasn't good, and then turn around and come right back. The problem was that at the time they took off, the weather had deteriorated to IFR conditions. It was overcast at 500 feet.
Oh, wow.
And the visibility had gotten really bad as well. So, and then it was very turbulent. It was extremely gusty. And they got up there. And as you know, as a pilot, turbulent conditions create spatial disorientation. It occurs even more prevalently in turbulent conditions. So they get up there and the airplane's just getting rocked. They're in the clouds. Randy loses his situational awareness and then goes into a graveyard spiral. But in going down the rabbit hole, I found another theory. Because they had been traveling all day in this airplane, somebody actually came up with a theory and made a blog post on it, a very well-written blog post where he does a lot of background research and goes looking for answers. There's a possibility that they may have been suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning as well. But the problem is that at this time, with the information that he has, he can't prove it. Nobody can prove it.
Right.
So the CAB, the Civil Aeronautics Board, which was the precursor to the NTSB, what they came up with was, well, he got spatially disoriented, and that's what led to him
flying into the ground.
Basically. And so, yes, so here's the thing is that puts a lot of onus on Randy Hughes. That puts all the onus on him, honestly.
Right.
And it almost demonizes him in that respect. And my goal here is not to demonize Randy Hughes. It's to look at the situation and come up with okay, guys, we can do things better. This is how we learn from these types of accidents.
Yeah, what can I take away from this?
But if Randy Hughes was suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning, they were, like I said, airplane, turbulence, let's add carbon monoxide into it, long, tiring day, and then you got the heavy smokers and all of that. It actually takes some of the onus off of him. The problem is that there really isn't a lot of evidence to support it,
Right.
this theory, And the author of this blog actually goes into detail and says, well, did my research that other Comanches have suffered from carbon monoxide leaks.
But just about every general aviation airplane.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
You could say that. I mean, look at the Mooney, look at
Right.
the, you know. And so, but it's an interesting theory.
It's interesting. I don't know that it necessarily takes the responsibility off of him because, I mean, that's one thing Dan Bass talked about with his carbon monoxide poisoning. And if you don't know about Dan Bass' story, check that out on our channel. It's one of our most popular In the Hangar episodes is when we talked to Dan Bass, who passed out in his Mooney and woke up in a snowy field at night. His plane miraculously landed itself. I mean, rough, but he survived.
Any landing you can walk away from.
Yeah, and Dan would talk about that he should have recognized the warning signs. So I don't know.
But it impairs your judgment. That's
it does
the thing.
impair your judgment.
And that's what I mean by taking the onus off of him is that, yeah, Dan's judgment was impaired. It's almost like having too many drinks or whatever. It's like having
you're
drinks.
drunk. Yeah.
Right. You're drunk,
and Dan
but you
talked
didn't,
about that.
Right.
Yeah.
You're drunk, but you didn't drink. Like you didn't put yourself in that position on purpose. And so same thing with Randy Hughes. I don't think he did anything really wrong up until that point. In fact, he tried to avoid the weather. So the question is, was his judgment impaired? Was he drunk, in essence,
with
carbon monoxide? And he was like, nah, we got this, man. We'll go. Or was it something else? Or was it really that macho attitude? And that's kind of where there's this fork in the road of where I want to take this story.
Okay. Well, let's back up a hair. FAA briefer. First of all, I've never heard of that. So back, I guess, in that time, they would have an FAA employee working at the airport?
At least at this airport. Mm-hmm. He actually had an office there at the Dyersburg, Tennessee airport.
So why, I would think as an FAA, obviously as a briefer, you can't tell a pilot not to fly or to fly. That's the pilot's decision. But if the field is IFR, how could he say, look, you're illegal to take off here?
So there's two things. So the FAA and the regulations that we have today are not the FAA and regulations we had back then.
Okay, fair enough.
So I don't know what they were allowed to say back then. But I have several air traffic controller friends, for example, they're FAA employees. They cannot tell VFR traffic or, like you and I, if we were just going flying around, they can't say that we're not allowed to go. But they can hint towards things. They can offer us other things. But they can't say, yes, you can do this. No, you can't do that.
Under VFR.
Well, I mean, yeah.
But like a Class D or towered airport that the airport has gone IFR, they can tell you you're not cleared to take off.
True. Well, yeah, if they don't have like an IFR clearance
or a special VFR or whatever.
But again, the FAA, like the regulations today are not the same as they were back then.
Okay.
And so a lot of these incidents, like we've talked about before, our regulations and rules are written in blood. And maybe this was one of those cases that led to changes in those types of things. Because what Randy said when he talked to Leroy, he said, okay, he gave him the plan. He said, which kind of leads me away from maybe he was drunk, because he made logical sense. He said, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take off from here. I'm going to fly due east until I find the Tennessee River. And then I'm going to follow the river. And then that'll get me to Nashville. And I just talked to my wife, and my wife said that the storm has passed. So all I have to do is fly low enough to stay under the deck until I find the river, and then I'm home free. The problem is that, over water is when you get that temperature and dew point spread that, like a lot of times clouds and stuff will form over those rivers. And that's exactly what happened. He did exactly what he said he was going to do. He took off and he was flying due east looking for the river, but never found it because the clouds had already formed in that area. And so Leroy couldn't tell him, at least at that time, you're not allowed to go.
That's too bad. The other thing that would poke a hole in the carbon monoxide theory, in addition to him being very logical and appearing not drunk on carbon monoxide, would be that all the different witnesses, did anybody ever say, well, Randy seemed to be, a little incoherent? Or
No.
Did his wife testify on that phone call that he sounded a little off?
Not at all.
So,
And not only that, but the passengers, none of them were.
Yes. Okay. So So in Dan Bass's case, he talked about how he was slurring words and things like that. So I find that interesting.
Yeah. So, and I think, but that's why I said there's really no evidence, but it's just something to think about.
Yeah.
You know, it's just one of those things. So, but that just goes to show the level of like work and research that we put into these stories. I would like to say that, yeah, we could, you know, chat GPT it or whatever, chat AI and bang one out.
Autopilot out these reports.
Yeah, exactly. But it really does. I mean, the last week and a half, I've been, you know, because we've been messaging almost every day. It's like every day I've been working on the story for at least an hour or two in the hotel rooms, you know, during trips, at home, etc. It's a lot. But, and it just kind of, we snake and we do different things. And you and I actually had one creative difference because you want me to kind of tie it in with like Kobe Bryant and stuff, and I have a different opinion on that, and that's another thing too. Well,
because of spatial disorientation, yeah. I recommended throwing in that this is similar to a couple of them, Buddy Holly and Kobe Bryant, because what I was trying to say there is that on these, I want to say ancient history crashes, 60 years ago, a lot of pilots and people might think, well, this doesn't really apply to, hey, yeah, cool story, dude. But it doesn't really apply to me because it was so long ago. And my point in recommending that you mention Kobe Bryant is that it shows people that the same problem that happened 60 years ago happened recently.
But it's a different problem.
Well, it's still spatial disorientation.
It is.
It just happened to pilot in this case, in Kobe Bryant, he actually had IMC training.
Right, and that's the big factor here.
But they both, it's like the training didn't matter. He still succumb to it. It's actually an even bigger lesson there.
Well, yeah, but I think but it's a different lesson in my opinion, because I have suffered. So true story, we took off out of Chicago last week and it was my leg and it was, you know, kind of garbage weather around the area, and we took off and I started to get the leans because we were in turbulent conditions, and it doesn't happen very often. But when it does, you have to reorient yourself, you know, back to the instruments. And that's exactly what I did. I felt like I was turning right, and I wasn't. We were straight and level. Well, we were, you know, climbing out, but we were behind another airplane taking off. It was already turbulent, but then we were also dealing with some wake turbulence and everything else. It was just very, very turbulent. And I found myself, but I've got the training and the experience, and so I just, you know, yoink, right back to my instruments. There are pilots that have the experience and the training that haven't done that get themselves into situations, which is what Kobe Bryant did.
Well, yeah.
Or Kobe Bryant's pilot.
Well, in that case, one of my clients is one of the major helicopter manufacturers, and they have a facility here near us, and we do a lot of shooting there. And they have a simulator for helicopters, and they did an IIMC training class, the first size inadvertent instrumentological conditions, because what they were finding is that helicopter pilots more than fixed wing pilots really don't fly in IMC.
Right.
And so even though I flew in a helicopter on a mission with a helicopter pilot who told me he was a double I in helicopter. I said, how much actual do you have? He said 0. So here he is, a double I. He's teaching instrument, and he's never flown in IMC.
So I think instead of a lack of experience or a lack of training or whatever, it's a lack of proficiency. That's the difference.
Okay, so, but in that case, so it's a lack of proficiency. In that case, it puts Kobe Bryant's pilot in the same with Randy Hughes.
See, and I differ. I think differently. Why? Because Randy Hughes didn't have a lack of proficiency. He had a lack of training and a lack of experience. 0.
But they equal the same thing. It's equaled the same result. They got spatially disoriented.
If you go down that path, though, now you're saying that, well, yeah, the end result was the same. It was a crash. You know, they got, so like an icing. So let's talk about like when American Eagle and the Roselawn incident. They got into, they were in IMC, but they were picking up ice, and the ice wound up, you know, causing a stall, and they spun it into the ground. You could say it's the same thing. They got into a situation they shouldn't have been in.
Well, yeah, that's a little bit more broad. I mean, I'm talking in when you get to the very specific, probable cause of these accidents, the probable cause is specifically the same thing.
So I
it's
think
Randy Hughes got spatially disoriented and flew into the ground. Kobe Bryant's pilot got spatially disoriented and flew into the ground.
Yes, but I think there were two different situations. I think that Kobe's pilot was under duress and pressure to go because of his clientele. I think that Randy had get-there-itis, and those are two different things.
True, I give you that.
They get into, right, they get up, they get into it, and you're right. Either way, they got spatially disoriented, and they wound up,
flying into the ground.
Right, flying into the ground. And so, but I think that it's, I see it as kind of two different things, though. I know you see it as like the same thing. Well, they got spatially disoriented. But see, Kobe's pilot, I think, has a little bit more onus because he had the experience.
True.
In a lot of ways, he had the experience to say, no, we're not going to go first and foremost. But in another way, he also had the experience and training to revert back to his instruments, and he didn't. And the question is, why? Why didn't he do that? Whereas like me, for example, I get a little bit of the leans, I go back to my instruments, and it's
well, I can answer that question because when we did the video on the IIMC training for the helicopter, they brought in helicopter pilots, different level training, and we shot them in the simulator. And to a person, pretty much they all crashed in the simulator when they were introduced to inadvertent IMC while flying the helicopter. I just believe that the rotor pilots and that's the whole point of what we were doing for this main manufacturer, was letting them know there's a whole training program for this, because helicopter pilots just are not proficient in flying an IMC, where fixed wing IFR rated pilots are.
Typically, yeah.
Typically.
There are obviously instrument rated. Like I would talk to, Brian, for example, Brian Turner.
Who has a Comanche.
He has a Comanche.
1 year newer than the one in Patsy Cline's case.
He's got a Comanche, but he's got an IFR rating, but he is not proficient. No, he admits that. This is not a slam at Brian in any means. Brian's one of our, best good friends.
Right.
Brian and I talk all the time about, and I go fly with him in the Comanche and put him under the foggles and say, all right, let's go do some holds and approaches. I want you to hand fly. Mm-hmm. You don't get to use the autopilot, because I'm trying to train his brain to, if he starts to get that sensation, he needs to revert back to his instruments. That, he's one that he's got some experience in IFR now, IMC flying. He's got the training, but does he have the proficiency? So to me, I see that as a different story. I think that Kobe's pilot thought he could handle it because he had the training and the experience. Randy Hughes thought he could handle it because he didn't think it was going to be that bad, but he didn't have the training or the experience. I think that we should do a review on Kobe.
Yeah, and we probably will.
And that, because to me, that's a different lesson. In fact, that's an even greater lesson. That's a
more dangerous in a lot of regards.
Yeah, because now you're overconfident, right?
Right.
You've got that confidence. Well, I'm trained. I've been in IMC before. I can do this. And then you go and you get yourself into a situation, and now you can't get out of it. And then you get spatially disoriented, and you thought you could handle it, but you couldn't. With Randy Hughes, I don't think he realized what he was getting into.
Yeah. Because
he didn't have the training and stuff. So that's just my point. But that's where you and I have these healthy debates, and I love it, by the way.
Well, and Patsy Cline is yours. So at the end of the day, you'll win that argument. And for those who have watched Christy's video on Patsy Cline, you'll notice that there is not a reference to Kobe Bryant. So
there will not be, no. But the thing is that the thing as we wrap up, so a lot of times what we do with these, we write these scripts, we bounce ideas off each other, and then we get together in the studio on the day that we're going to film. We kind of we rehearse it, and we make some last minute changes, and then we film it, and then we edit it and produce it. Right now we're at the stage where we are in the studio, of course, and we're getting ready to rehearse it and film it. And I'm still at a crossroads because I want to talk more about Randy Hughes. He was the pilot, but
There's nothing out
There
there.
really isn't anything out there. So if there is anybody out there that actually has more information on Randy Hughes, now here's a really interesting story that didn't make its way into my script because there's things that I want to talk about, but they don't really tie into the story very well. Randy Hughes' wife, Kathy, was Cowboy Copa's daughter. So Cowboy Copas was Randy Hughes' father-in-law. So Kathy lost her dad and her husband in the same crash.
Wow.
And that's a really interesting tidbit, but like, it's hard to write. It's kind of like the Patsy Cline, and I actually wound up taking out that one section about her abusive father and her seeing him, her going to see him on his deathbed a few years later, because it's a side fact that's really interesting. And I wish I could be like, oh, here's an interesting side note. Here's an interesting side note.
We get to do whatever we want. So if you want to put that in, you should put it in. And
I know. It's just, I'm trying to make things flow. I want the story to be cohesive and flow. But it's hard to kind of,
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way.
Like, and you mentioned at the top of this podcast that, like, when you had the John Denver script and you sent it to the first draft to me, and I mentioned that we spend a lot of time on John Denver's life before we ever even get to the crash. But it didn't stop you. I didn't want to stop you from doing that. I was like, okay, this is going to be different. We'll probably get complaints from viewers that say, hey, I thought this was going to be about the crash. And we did get those comments. But what amazed me, we got even more comments about, wow, I didn't know that all about John Denver. Oh, I didn't know he grew up in Fort Worth. Oh, I didn't know this and that. And so I thought, that's great. Sure, we got the comments like, crash doesn't even start until 8 minutes in, and that kind of stuff. But, I think that was great. And I encourage you to, first of all, be yourself. And you're going to pull up the things that you find interesting in your research. And I think that's great.
Right. Well, and the thing with John Denver is that, like we said before, he was the pilot. And it was ultimately his life experiences that led him to that point. With Patsy Cline, this is different. It was also her life experiences, of course, that led her to this point, but it doesn't necessarily talk about why the crash happened. And that's kind of where I'm at right now, because I want it to be more about the pilot. I want it to be, why did Randy Hughes, what led him to make the decisions he made to continue that flight that night when they should have stayed? But I could also be like, well, why didn't Patsy say no? Because she didn't know. She wasn't a pilot. She trusted him and his judgment, which turned out to be not great judgment. But the problem that I'm running up against, though, is that Patsy Cline is the star of this story, unfortunately. When this crash happened, people don't talk about Cowboy Copas. They don't talk about Hawkshaw Hawkins outside of, they were in the airplane. They were at the benefit. They died as well, unfortunately. Here's another interesting side note. There was another country music star at the time who died in a car crash going to Patsy Cline's funeral.
Yeah.
So that's why I said the story is just riddled with tragedy.
Yeah.
It's the whole reason they went to Kansas City was a benefit concert for another musician who had died. Then they die, and then more people die. It's such a sad story, and it's one that's really hard to tell, but it's one that needs to be told. And the difference with John Denver and Patsy Cline is that there wasn't a lot out there about John Denver and about the crash that was cohesive. It wasn't, here's his life that led up to this, him making these decisions on this point. There are stories out there with Patsy Cline, and that's kind of the other thing,
we had
too.
the same thing with Buddy Holly.
Yeah, exactly. But John Denver literally took off. We got over 1 million views on that video in 4 months. Because there wasn't, it was new information, if you will. It was a cohesive story. When I wrote that script, I had to go to several different entities, pull everything together, including the NTSB report, and put it together. And then I made this cohesive story. With Patsy Cline, it's different. People know that she was a country music star and that she died in a plane crash, and there's other ones out there. So I'm really interested to see how this is going to turn out. I am personally interested, and I'm extremely honored to tell her story. I grew up listening to Patsy's music. My aunt listened to her music. So I remember we literally had an old record player, and my aunt would literally put on these records, and it would be, Patsy Cline. And so I knew about her. I just didn't know the details of her life. And the more I learned, the more intrigued I got. But unfortunately, all those little details that intrigue me don't really lead into the story of as to why this crash happened.
Yeah. And
so like her visiting her father she would later say that her father was very abusive to her when she was a kid. Her father would abandon their family. Her mom and dad split up and her dad just abandoned him. I think it was like 10 years later or something after that happened. Her dad was on his deathbed. He was dying of lung cancer. And when Patsy found out, she convinced her mom to go and visit her father on his deathbed. And she said, well, you know, this is it. He's dying, so we better go make peace with it. And like, that's just the kind of person she was. She kind of stood up out of her own. But again, that doesn't really tell the story of why this crash happened. It talks about Patsy, but it doesn't play into the crash at all.
No, but neither did some of this stuff on John Denver. So I think it's just good background. Because like you said, it shows who she is.
Right.
So I would encourage you to include it if you feel like including it.
But the things that happened with John really did play into the crash. They played into his personality, which led into why he made those decisions. Because John was effectively exiled as a kid.
Because John was the
he
pilot.
He was overcompensating effectively.
And he was the pilot. I mean, because
exactly.
really the cause of the crash in all these celebrity crashes is not going to be the celebrity.
Right.
Kobe Bryant did not cause a helicopter crash.
He didn't fly the helicopter into the ground. No. Patsy did not fly the airplane into the ground.
Randy Rhoads didn't fly the VTOL. No, Randy Rhoads.
Oh, Randy Rhoads?
Yeah, that's the one I'm working on.
Oh, okay. You keep saying Randy Rhoads, and I'm like, Randy
Rhoads? Because I've been researching. We talk about research. The one I'm working on is going to be 3 weeks after your Patsy Cline.
Interesting.
And that's the Randy Rhoads crash. And that's why I keep accidentally saying Randy Rhoads.
What I'm learning is that it's this time of year and guys named Randy.
Yeah. All right. Very cool. So this brings our first official ever Flat Out podcast to a close. And I appreciate you guys listening. We're going to try to build this podcast, give you guys something maybe a little bit different, a view behind the scenes here at the Taking Off International World Headquarters. So as you can hear the trains and the cars in the background.
All right. Yeah. I'm excited about it. I'm just going to rename this podcast Debates with Dan.
Yeah. All right. And we'll see you guys later. Thanks for tuning in.